Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Friendly Circle Berlin. My name is Patrick, and I'm going to be your host. And today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jan Winhall, who many of you know. I don't think she needs much introduction to this group. Jan has very kindly put on these wonderful workshops, Somatic Mondays, for the past few months, and will continue with these for us. And today's workshop title is called Authenticity versus Attachment. And a little description. So, who is the authentic you? That is the big question. After all you've been through, there is a you in there that it is emerging, a you that is longing for safety and social connection, a you that needs to feel safe to be authentic. Healing involves rediscovering your authentic self, that part of you that knows and trusts your gut feelings. And that was written by Jan as part of the introduction. The entire introduction is in chat. But Jan, even your introduction was so well put together and so well written, just like your book. And we are studying Jan's book, The 20 Embodied Practices for Healing Trauma and Addiction. I'll put details about the book study also in chat. Jan, you bring us so much, and we all really appreciate you very much. So I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Boy, I see people just pouring in here. Okay, I'm closing this off now, so I won't be distracted. Hello, everybody. So nice to really get to know you. You know, I'm really recognizing some people and connecting, especially, I guess, in the book study. And there's Robert Ragucci again. Robert is my FSPM facilitator. I'm sure you guys know. So, authenticity versus attachment. Three words, a simple little 3-word phrase that is, I think, profound. Really, really profound when we start to explore it and unpack it, and particularly take it into the body. You know, these are Gabor Mate's words, 3 little words: authenticity. So being my authentic self versus being the way I've learned to be to hold on to the people that I need. That's what he means by attachment, right? In attachment, there's a whole kind of study, a field called attachment. We've touched on this before when we look at those early childhood relationships and how those early relationships with mom and dad and other people, important people in our lives, shape how we experience the world. And how so often when we struggle with addiction, we're really struggling to be able to soothe ourselves. And a lot of that struggle can have to do with those early relationships in our families and how the people who were looking after us were able to meet our needs and to soothe us, not perfectly, but enough of the time that we began to trust. We began to trust in a world that would respond to our needs enough of the time so that we could feel safe in our bodies. And then our little nervous systems, you know, when we're infants, would start to be shaped in a way that activated that ventral branch of the nervous system, the place where we feel safe inside in our bodies and where we can heal and grow and really restore health, growth, and restoration, Steve Porges would say, the father of polyvagal theory. So understanding how our parents responded to us as little children, little babies, how far back that goes in our bodies, and even before that when we're in the womb, and how our mothers are experiencing safety in the world, and what kinds of attachments, relationships our mom had to the people that she needed support from. So if in our bodies there isn't that safety, that your mom didn't have that safety in her body, our bodies will be shaped by that too. And for a lot of us who struggle with being able to ground and soothe in the world, it does go that far back, right? Not for everybody, but probably for most of us who struggle with that stuff, it does. I think some of that is changing now with the prevalence of technology and screen time for kids. It's a very challenging time, I think, to be a parent. So I'm going to share with you these two attachment styles, or actually 4 attachment styles that we've worked on, but 2 nervous system styles that reflect this struggle with being able to ground ourselves. And even very recently, Steve Porges has been meeting with people in the community, trauma therapists, who are working on how to really understand what the nervous system looks like when we're not just under threat, but when we have the kind of style of appeasing to another person, trying to please that person who has power over us. And how that is different than what people are calling fawning, which is where we kind of comply with what is expected to be done, but without really feeling connected in any way in terms of wanting to really please that person. So we'll get into what that looks like in the nervous system. We'll go into some slides for that, and then I'll come back and we'll have lots of time to be able to share and talk and do some embodied kind of practice around this. But we do want to be really tender with this, because feeling into the place in the body that is kind of wired to serve another person, to please and appease another person that we're afraid of, often brings up tremendous shame. And so the wonders and the beauty of working with the nervous system is that I think it's the most potent way of really healing shame. Because when we begin to understand that biologically, our nervous system will do whatever it takes in order to survive, including trying to please another person that we're afraid of, it really takes away so much of that shaming behavior. Okay. So, the trauma of addiction. One of the things I'm really beginning to come to terms with, and really, I think, speak about, is that I think that in our culture, it's bad enough to be struggling with addictive processes, but what is also making it a lot harder to heal is the kind of trauma that we are inflicting on folks who are struggling with addiction through shaming. We don't live in a culture that understands addiction in a compassionate way. And the kind of shaming that goes on is really difficult for folks to recover from. So I want to make the distinction there between the struggle with soothing ourselves. That's one thing. But the way in which the addicted person is viewed in our culture, much of the time, is making it a lot harder for people to heal from addiction. So we can change that. And that's what the depathologizing kind of model is about. It's about understanding how we can heal addictive processes through the vagus nerve by viewing them, as we do, as these state regulation strategies that shift us out of a pathologizing paradigm. And remembering our word for how we understand the nervous system, Steve Porges' word of neuroception. So if you're new to today's watching Somatic Mondays, we've covered a lot of this and I want to just touch on it, but you can go back. The beauty is you can go back and watch these other Somatic Mondays that we've done where we've really built on the material. So through neuroception, right now, we're all unconsciously noticing, our body is noticing how safe we feel inside, and it shifts us to these different states in order to help us to stay alive. And that is all done without our awareness. And so here's our 7Fs that we've worked on before. This is a more complicated, kind of a complex model of the 7Fs. It's what I call the clinician model for those of you who want to get a little more into the depths of it. But basically, we're looking at the addictions as these ways of shifting us back and forth in the nervous system from the constriction of that sympathetic, mobilized flight fight state in the body down into the dorsal, shutting down the heaviness in the body and back again. And I think if you follow that sense in your own body of tightness and constriction, and then doing whatever it is that you've learned to do to help yourself to shift out of that, that often becomes addictive because it works. And because if your body does not feel safe enough to find ways of being able to release and relax, it will go to ways that will do that for us, particularly things like drugs and alcohol, and lots of processed behavioral addictions are really good at that. And they help us to be able to survive. So we see in this model, Mark Lewis's learning model of addiction. I won't go into this, but just for those of you that you're curious to check out his wonderful book, The Biology of Desire. He really helps us to understand the neuroplasticity of addiction, what it looks like in the brain, and how brains walk down that pathway and become stuck in a kind of rut in addictive cycles that go over and over again. The good news is we can change those neural pathways, and that's what our practices do. So in this model, we actually see addictions as adaptive responses to maladaptive environments, to environments where we don't feel that it's safe to be authentic, to be the real me. And so these behaviors, and there's so many of them, as we know, right, become addictive over time because they work. They help us to be able to shift out of these really uncomfortable places in the body. And so let's look at these two nervous system states that people are talking a lot about, actually, in the world of the nervous system and somatic therapy. The first one, the one that I want us to really spend some time on here, is a blended state. So we know we have these three main states, and then we have blended states in the nervous system. This blended state is called favoring others for survival. That's what we call it in the 7Fs. And this is what Steve Porges calls appeasing. It'll be interesting to talk with you about and explore how much appeasing and favoring others is like what in the 12-step world you would call codependence. Okay? The other state that people are curious about and sometimes get confused between the two is what we call fold, and it's here in this kind of, and fawn rather, in this kind of freeze, fold, fawn, trauma feedback loop up here. Right? So fold is collapsing. Fawn is this combination of sympathetic and dorsal. And then, and here in folding in and fawning, the body is really just shutting down. So it's complying when it feels unsafe, but it's not engaging with the person. It's just doing whatever you need to do in order to stay safe, hiding in the corner, numbing and shutting down and dissociating, often not even remembering what happened. Here you see often the non-protective mother in an abusive situation, or a father. But favoring others for survival, appeasement, as Steve Porges calls it, is a more complex state because it includes, you'll see here, it includes the trauma feedback loop. So you're struggling to try to regulate, but it also includes some ventral energy. So we see how it comes down into the sense of there is some safety in the body, enough to be able to, in a sense, figure out what the person or the group you're afraid of is wanting from you, say the scary dad, and give that person or the critical mom what it is that you think they need in order to feel comfortable enough with you to leave you alone. So that's a very different state than fawning and just shutting down and hiding in the corner. And it's one that people are talking about a lot because there's a lot of curiosity around this way in which particularly marginalized groups in our culture, people who have less power, have coped with managing situations where they can't be authentic because it isn't safe to be authentic. They have to stay and preserve that attachment with the person that has power over them. And when we grow up in the trauma feedback loop, this is almost always what's happening. So let's just pause for a moment and notice in your own lives, feeling into how was it that you related to the folks in your immediate family? Did you feel that sense of needing to shut down, to fawn and comply in order to just stay safe? Was there a safe place in your family? Maybe outside, maybe a teacher, maybe a neighbor next door, where you could be more of your authentic self, your real self? Or maybe there's a way that you really learned how to give that person or that group what they needed in order to feel, in a sense, safe with you so that they'd leave you alone. But you sacrificed, because you had to, who you really are. It's a big question, right? And so often when we live in marginalized groups through things like racism and misogyny or poverty, hypermasculinity, where everybody has to not need anybody, or everybody has to be the same, we end up masking. We end up hiding who we really are in order to stay alive. And that state in the nervous system of appeasement often results in folks developing addictive behaviors because you're stuck in that trauma feedback loop. And remember, you can't stay in one of those states forever. So you're going to shift back and forth. So safety really is the precursor to developing self-regulation and regulation, co-regulation in the group. So we know about these blended states, right? Blended states are so important to understand in the nervous system and how our bodies are always changing and moving around. And so there may be times where you needed to just, fawn and collapse and hide in the corner. And there may be other times where you learned how to manipulate that group or that person that was terrifying in order to stay alive. And while we are shamed by that in our culture, this work is about liberating us from that shame by understanding that this is all about survival. And bodies are smart. Appeasing is a very clever strategy to be able to manage a situation that feels really overwhelming. So we've talked a little bit about these different styles of attachment, and particularly, of course, if we have a secure enough attachment, we can be our authentic selves. Our parents can hear if we don't like something, or we're upset, or we're angry. But in other situations where your attachment is what we call disorganized, you're either terrified of a parent or the parent is terrified and shut down and not available to you. So there's nobody there to really be able to form a safe, loving connection with and to learn that it's safe to be who you really are. And that is crushing to the spirit, right? When we can't be who we really are. And so it's so important to create these spaces and communities like Friendly Circle Berlin and my community at FSPM, where we can be who we really are. We really work towards that with integrity. Yeah. So this, I think, is a really good picture of what it looks like to be fawning, to be in that trauma feedback loop, shutting down in dorsal. You're not dead. You can see this person is alive in there. But boy, are they ever shrouded and shutting down in order to hide. So we just really take that into the body, knowing that it comes from the need to be safe and feeling into the need to be safe in the community here right now when we're all together in the group. And that's different than what appeasement looks like. Favoring others for survival can look kind of alive and lively, and yet you see there's this kind of vacant sense in this young woman's face. Somebody's in there, but she's also connecting enough that there's some aliveness there. So we see favoring others for survival. You can't always see it because people can become really good at masking, right? But it is what we would call an adaptive survival response in a threatened nervous system. And there are many faces to favoring others for survival. There's a suffering face, a vacant stare, and many ages, many genders. A young girl who's trying to figure out how to stay alive, and then, of course, sacrifices her own sense of authenticity. And when that's kind of drilled out of you for so long, it's hard to even know who you are. Who is this person inside me? You know, the sense of self gets shaped around the powerful group. And so healing is not just about stopping something you're doing that's become addictive, right? We know this. It's about really understanding how you've lived in your body in terms of your nervous system and your felt sense. You know, what is my felt sense of this moment right now as we're here talking about tender stuff, about who is the authentic me? It's a big question. Yeah. But we do it with such compassion for the body's way of keeping us alive. So remember, we have our two basic tools or skills that we use. One of them is recognizing where am I in my nervous system? And the other is our practice of felt sensing, coming deeper and deeper into the body. I will share the slides with you too, so don't worry about that. And then, of course, triggers, right? Triggers that activate the states of appeasement, favoring other people, and also of fawning and shutting down, and also of getting stuck in fight, right? So triggers are these, as you know, these intense experiences that when they happen, they feel like they're so real and fresh in the moment, and yet they're these lost experiences that are like what we used to call fresh frozen. They're lost, wounded places that are kind of struggling, suspended in space, looking for a place to be heard. And while they feel often terrifying, it really is our body's way of saying, hello, there's a wound here, and it needs company. And that's how we can really come into the body, into focusing and spending time, particularly with a partner, right? In connecting in with those wounded places. But we have to do it carefully with titration. And we've talked about this too in some of our Somatic Mondays. Ways that if we get too close and get activated into flight or fight, we can find ways to step back from that. We can also find ways to come forward if we're too far away and numbing, particularly if we're still really in that active, addictive process. We'll be shifting back and forth. The body will be trying to numb in order to survive and hide the authentic self because it doesn't feel safe. So this is a process recording from a focusing session that I think gives us a really deep, beautiful way of understanding a person who is struggling with authenticity and at the same time really working on coming deeper into the body, into a focusing process. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that process, I think it gives you a really potent sense of what it's like to be able to come down into the body, to find your authentic self, and to be listened to by a partner. So I'm just going to read this to you. During today's focusing partnership session, I noticed that I shut down almost immediately once I turned my attention inward. It felt as if my system couldn't tolerate being seen, even by myself. My body became very heavy, a deep, sinking weight in my chest, shoulders, and legs. It wasn't an emotion at first, more like a dense fog or gravity pulling me down. This would be dorsal. I could sense something was there, but it was inaccessible, like I was too close to it and too far away at the same time, spinning around, right? As my partner reflected my felt sense back to me, I realized I wasn't able to find words. Everything inside felt frozen and muted, and yet the heaviness kept increasing. I tried to stay present, but my awareness kept moving toward shutting down. There was no clear memory or image, only an atmosphere of exhaustion and deep sadness. Again, that dorsal state, something that felt very old and familiar. After the session ended and I closed the Zoom call, I started crying almost immediately. The crying continued for nearly 3 hours without really knowing why. It felt like something in me had been waiting for permission to release. There would be the felt shift, we would call it. And once it began, I couldn't stop it. There was no clear storyline attached to the tears, just a raw bodily grief that I hadn't realized was still living there. Afterward, I felt drained, but I also felt somewhat relieved, like a small opening had been made through which something could breathe again. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it felt significant, as if my body knew something my mind didn't. It also left me wondering how to meet these moments of shutdown with more gentleness instead of fear, and how to recognize when my system needs containment versus when it's safe to go deeper. I'm sitting with these questions as I integrate. What part of me was so overwhelmed that it needed to shut down? What was the crying trying to express that couldn't come through words? How can I learn to stay with such intensity without losing connection to safety? Although the session was difficult, I can sense that something meaningful was touched. I feel grateful for the partnership space and for my partner's quiet presence, which helped me begin to trust that even shutdown has wisdom, that maybe the body's way of protecting me deserves just as much listening as the parts that can speak. So I just want to round this off with saying a little bit about the other end of appeasing or folding and shutting down and fawning behavior. And that's often the partner that's stuck in fight. And this place is often diagnosed as having borderline personality disorder, which we would call, from a nervous system perspective, an adaptation to a very threatened nervous system, right? So while one nervous system gets stuck in pleasing and appeasing, the other gets stuck in fight. And then they're into this kind of abusive dynamic. And that it's really important to have a kind of trauma-informed therapy for those who are also struggling with their own abusive behavior. That those who end up getting stuck in fight are almost always those who started off in flight, in their own struggle to be able to survive through fear. And that as therapists and coaches and friends and partners, focusing partners and 12-step partners, that we can really play a vital role in helping ourselves and the people in our lives to learn how to regulate between being that fired up place in the nervous system, that blending of feeling safe and also feeling like fired up about something you're excited about or having fun and being playful. When that slips up into fight, then we're in trouble. So the more that we can regulate, learn how to settle back down into grounding, and the more we can give those cues of safety to the people around us, the more the world heals, really. And that really is like a kind of collective co-regulation that we're doing now, that this inner work of learning how to regulate the nervous system emerges into this collective kind of co-regulation that we have here and now. And this then brings us to really joyful moments of feeling liberated from shame and blame, which only keeps us stuck in a kind of rigid pattern and where nobody feels really safe inside. And that's how you can connect with me again. I just thought I would throw that in so you know. All right, let's come back and let's just take a moment, because that's a lot and it's heavy, and see how everybody's doing. Maybe let's just take a moment to take a breath if you feel safe in your body to do that. And just notice where you are in your nervous system. You might want to look around at those of us who are here and can connect with each other. Give a little cue of safety and a smile. And feel your feet on the floor. And maybe just really so gently and beautifully touching into that authentic me inside there. The me that wants to come out. And that when we create these safe spaces together, that me can begin to blossom over time. So can you feel a kind of nice settling in? Often people feel that settling in the upper chest. Yeah. And your feet on the floor. You might want to stand up if that feels good. Sometimes feeling the weight of gravity, bringing us into the body. That feels very grounding for people, feeling that weight. Yeah. And knowing that gravity holds us up, which is amazing, right? Because that's like this connection to the natural world, to the universe, something greater than us. I write about this, authenticity versus attachment, in 20 embodied practices. It's on page, to put my glasses on to see the number. It's terrible. 155, if you have. And if you check out, if you follow Gabor, he's doing a lot now on social media around authenticity versus attachment. And he talks about, hard stuff. Like, what do you do when we're really growing, right? And learning to find that real self in there. And the people around us don't like it. That's hard. That's really tough. Because we're starting to make boundaries, for example, right? And people aren't used to that. It's a very common place to get stuck. So it's good to name it.
Any thought you'd like to take us out with, Jan?
Well, how about the joy in realizing that we can explore really painful places and have a lot of fun?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that healing doesn't have to be all drudgery and suffering and fear. We can have fun. And that's some of the best experience we can have, right? Fun and joy and connection and supporting each other.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you so much. I put the links back in there, and then everybody can unmute and have a lot of fun saying their thank yous. Let me see. Let me allow everybody. There we go. Everybody's
All
here.
right.
Thank you, Jan.
Good.
so much.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jan.
Everybody.
Thank you for making it
So much.
fun.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks,
Great.
Jane. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Patrick.
Bye-bye.